The orphanage stood at the top of an isolated hill, surrounded by ancient trees with twisted branches and a silence so deep it seemed to have become part of the land itself. Its facade was made of dark stone, covered in moss and cracks as old as the horrors that had once lived there. The windows were shattered on almost every floor, but some, mainly on the second level, remained intact, with curtains still hanging, as if someone had arranged them only moments ago. The iron gate was slightly ajar, rusty, but without a lock. No private property signs, no police tape, nothing to keep away those who, for some obscure reason, felt drawn to enter. And over the years, many did. Travelers, the curious, teenagers playing at being brave. None stayed for long, none left unchanged. Some never left at all. It was said that the orphanage had been abruptly shut down one cold December night many years ago, after a tragedy that was never fully explained. Newspapers wrote about a fire. Government records claimed the place had been evacuated due to lack of resources. But the old residents, the few who still lived nearby, told a different story. They spoke of screams echoing at night, of children seen at the windows begging for help even after the building had been abandoned. They said animals avoided that hill and told of a shepherd dog that once ran in pure terror until it dropped dead from a heart attack after stepping into the main hall. They also spoke of the woman who worked there and who, after the closure, vanished as if she had never existed. Her name appeared in no official document, but everyone called her Susan. Inside, the orphanage remained far too intact for a place that no one maintained. The furniture was covered in dust, but organized. Plates were still laid out on the dining room tables, as if lunch had been interrupted halfway through. On the hallway walls, framed children's drawings showed faces with distorted features, oversized eyes, sewn mouths, and bleeding hands. The floor creaked with every step, but it wasn't only the sound of dry wood. It creaked as if it were answering, as if it were complaining. Doors slammed on their own. Lights, though the building had no power, flickered as if powered by something unseen. The main dormitory was the largest room, lined with rows of bunk beds, each covered by torn blue blankets. On some of the beds, teddy bears still lay on their backs, staring at the ceiling. And on one of the walls, there was a phrase written in a childish hand, but with something wrong in the way it was shaped. "We're still here." And beneath it, dozens of vertical marks, scratched with fingernails, so many that the wood was worn away, hollowed out, as if children had been counting the days, or the nights, or the victims. Despite its abandonment, there was no smell of mold or rot. What one felt upon entering was something much denser, a warm, humid suffocation, as if the air itself was alive, as if the house breathed on its own, as if it recognized who came inside. And more than that, as if it were waiting, because everything there seemed frozen in time, except for one thing, the main door, a massive oak door with a cross-shaped handle. It was ajar, never locked, never fully closed. As if, since that forgotten night, someone, or something, had been tasked with keeping it that way, always open inward, never outward. The story of the orphanage seemed asleep, buried under layers of silence, neglect, and fear. But the arrival of a new visitor, many years later, would awaken it all once more. Her name was Ava, and she had no idea what that place was hiding, nor that by crossing that half-open door, she no longer belonged to the world of the living. Ava was 32 years old with clear eyes, a firm expression, and a face that carried a strange balance between youthful vitality and deep exhaustion. A forensic psychologist specializing in institutional environments, she had been hired by an NGO with the mission of assessing old welfare structures across the country for a project that combined historical recovery with the possibility of future revitalization. When the orphanage appeared on the list, it was treated like just another inspection site, but none of the information about the place seemed clear. There were conflicting dates, mismatched addresses, documents about children who did not exist in any official system. And even so, the order was simple. Visit, document, and file a report. Simple, objective, cold. Ava followed these instructions with the same rigor she applied to all of her cases. But from the moment her car crossed the rusty gate, something inside her seemed to shrink, as if a part of herself had been left behind. And nothing in the world could explain the sensation of familiarity that came over her as she laid eyes on that grim building's facade for the very first time. She entered through the front door carrying a flashlight, a digital camera, a voice recorder, and a folder filled with old records. Natural light still reached parts of the rooms, but the silence was so absolute that her own footsteps seemed out of place, as if displaced from the reality around her. The instant she crossed the main hall, Ava froze. She heard something that sounded like a long breath, but it wasn't hers. There was no one there. Only the dust-covered staircase and 2 long corridors leading to old classrooms and dormitories. For a brief moment, Ava considered going back to the car, reorganizing her documents, checking her phone signal. But she decided to keep going. The recorder picked up the ambient sound, just the groan of the wooden floor, the whistling wind against the broken windows, and a thud from upstairs. A single dry thud, as if something had been deliberately knocked over. Ava stood motionless for 2 seconds. Then she began to climb. The second floor was darker. The curtains, surprisingly intact, blocked out the light. Ava approached a door with the number 6. When she pushed it open, she found a room that was empty except for 4 beds. But the beds were burned, and the mattresses still bore what looked like the imprints of hands. The smell there was different, like clothes that had been stored away for decades, or the stale sweat of children absorbed into the wood. On the wall, chalk drawings, not childlike but deeply disturbing, depicted terror. Oversized eyes, gaping mouths, ropes, shadows. Ava took photos, recorded everything with her voice recorder, and wrote in her notes, "Room 6, disturbing. It looks like they slept here until the end." In the center of the room, there was a circle made of broken toys, and in the very middle of it, a single button, a small button from a child's shirt, as if someone had disappeared right there. That was all. And for the first time, Ava felt fear crawl inside her. That night, she decided to stay at a distant inn, but she could not sleep. Her dreams were filled with the sounds of chains, children crying, and someone whispering her name just outside the window. When she woke, the clock read 3:03, the same time noted in one of the old files. Daniel wakes up every night at 3:03, saying that the Lady of Silence is calling. The next day, Ava returned to the orphanage, determined to finish the inspection quickly and close the report with a negative recommendation. But something stopped her. When she stepped inside again, she saw a door open that she could have sworn had been locked the day before. It was the old headmistress's office. In the corner, beneath a pile of stacked furniture, a floorboard was loose, and beneath it, a notebook. It wasn't just any notebook. The cover had been scratched violently, almost torn apart. The name Daniel appeared over and over, as if the child was trying to remember who he was. The first pages contained normal drawings, but halfway through everything changed. Phrases like, "She hears everything, you must not cry. If you answer, she comes in," repeated again and again. The last page was wet, as though someone had wept over it recently. And on it, written in trembling letters, was the message that made Ava's heart stop. "The new lady has arrived. She came in yesterday. She has blonde hair and sad eyes." Ava closed the notebook with trembling hands. It was a description of herself. Ava could not stop staring at that final page. Her name was not written there explicitly, but everything, every single detail, matched her. The blonde hair tied back in a messy bun, the sad eyes, something she had been told all her life, and even the act of walking into the building the night before. It was impossible. The last registered child named Daniel in that orphanage had vanished decades ago, and the building had been abandoned for at least 20 years. The notebook paper was old, yes, but not old enough. The ink still smelled fresh. The page, though yellowed, felt as though it had been wet only recently. Ava felt dizzy, as if the floor beneath her feet had tilted slightly. She wanted to believe it was psychological, but the chill running down her spine was not from her mind. It came from the air. The air around her had changed. It had become heavy, damp, as if by opening that notebook, something had been awakened. She put it inside her backpack with trembling hands, trying to force herself to stay focused. She needed to finish that inspection. But a part of her already knew this was no ordinary evaluation. Something was happening here, and it was happening to her. When she went back down to the ground floor, she found the front door closed completely, the same door that never locked. She pushed the handle, threw her shoulder against it, even tried to force it with a master key. Nothing worked. It was as if the building had swallowed her whole. She grabbed her phone, no signal. Tried the radio, dead. No static, no noise, nothing. Only a silence that felt more and more aware. In the dining hall, where before she had seen empty tables covered with dust, there were now plates neatly arranged. The floor was clean, the chairs slightly pushed back, as if children had just stood up from their seats. In the corner of the room, near a broken stained glass window, a small wheelchair, rusted, empty, but its wheels were still spinning as if someone had pushed it just seconds ago. Ava felt a wild impulse to run, but she held herself back, took a deep breath. She needed to understand. So she returned to the headmistress's office, where she had found the notebook. On the floor, next to the gap in the floorboards, there was now something else, a doll. The doll was grotesque, made of cloth sewn with black thread, with eyes made from mismatched buttons, one blue and one white. The mouth, however, was the most disturbing part. It did not exist. There was only a red-stitched line where the mouth should have been, and on its back, a phrase written in letters far too small to be a child's. "If she hears you, she stays." Ava placed the doll in a plastic bag, feeling the weight of everything around her. Was she in the middle of a delusion, a trap, a hallucination brought on by stress? But something in the smell of the doll, something in the texture of the stitches, it was all far too real, and worse, far too personal. She returned to the dormitory where room 6 was located. This time, when she stepped inside, she smelled smoke, strong, present, as if something were burning at that very moment. The beds were exactly the same as before, except for one detail: the names carved into the headboards. Previously erased, they were now clearly visible, written in chalk. Lucas, Mia, Daniel, and Ava, written with trembling letters, but unmistakable. It was her name on the empty bed, the one without a teddy bear, the one facing directly toward the closet. And on that closet door, slightly ajar, two small hands clutching the gap as if someone was inside, watching in silence. Ava approached in shock, pulling the door open with force, but there was nothing. Only old children's clothes and the sound of something running down the hallway outside. She bolted after it, pointed her flashlight, panting, trembling, heart racing, and she saw, at the turn of the corridor, a child, facing away, head lowered, body completely still. As she drew closer, Ava noticed that the child looked drawn. The outlines of the body trembled as though they had been sketched with fresh charcoal on wet paper, and the child spoke without turning. "You brought her name back." Before Ava could react, the lights flickered, and when they came back on, the child was gone. On the floor, only a single folded sheet of paper remained, written in shaky handwriting, like a diary entry. She doesn't like it when they write her name. That's how it all started. That night, Ava did not leave. Not because she didn't want to, but because she couldn't. The front door remained locked, as though sealed from within. The windows were reinforced with iron bars she hadn't noticed before, and the basement, the one whose door had been opened the day before, was now locked with heavy padlocks that looked far from new. It was as if the orphanage itself was changing the deeper she went inside, as if the walls had a memory, as if in some way that defied reason, they were reacting to her presence. Ava decided to spend the night inside, in the room that had once been the dining hall. She unrolled a sleeping bag, pressed her back against the wall, and left the recorder running just in case. It was her way of holding on to sanity. But that night, the recorder would capture more than she would ever be able to endure. At first, there was only the sound of the wind. But shortly after 2 in the morning came the cracks, then the whispers, soft, childlike voices, impossible to decipher, that seemed to come from within the very walls. Ava, wide awake, froze. The sound grew slowly, as if gathering courage. The voices weren't far away. They were right behind her, as if children were trapped inside the bricks. She pressed her ear against the wall, and for a brief moment the sound became clear. Someone was saying her name, and then, in a chorus of childish voices, "Don't say anything, don't answer. She hears through the concrete." Ava pulled away, panic coursing through her body, her breathing ragged as she looked around. But the room was empty. The recorder kept capturing everything, the sounds now sharper, muffled screams, scratching noises, and a low laugh. A woman's laugh. Trying to keep control, Ava resumed her inspection through the hallway of dormitories, flashlight in one hand and recorder in the other. But what she found was even worse: fresh scratches on the paint, words carved with a fingernail or a blade. "Speak, and she comes. She is downstairs. The voice is not hers." Phrases layered over each other, in different sizes, at heights that matched children of different ages, and among them a drawing of something that did not look human. A thin body with arms far too long and a face sewn shut. Below the drawing, a caption: "Silence is respect." Ava's throat went dry. Her whole body seemed to reject that place, as if she were being invaded from within, as if something was taking root in her mind. Then, as she passed the row of classrooms, a voice called out to her. Clear, coming from behind a wall, a boy's voice. "Doctor, help me." Ava pressed her ear against the wall and answered without thinking. "Daniel?" The silence that followed was absolute, deadly. And then came the reply, "Now she knows." And the wall trembled, as if something was moving behind it, as if something enormous had been awakened and was crawling through the bowels of the building. Ava staggered back, tripped, fell flat onto the dusty floor. And on the ceiling above her, faded inscriptions began to reappear, resurrected by her presence. Names of children, dates, crossed-out words, and at the center, a sentence written in soot. "She hears through the concrete." Desperate, Ava ran to the service staircase, trying to reach the attic to lock herself in for safety. But as she climbed, she saw a child, sitting on the third step, a girl with braids wearing an old orphanage uniform, still, with open eyes, sewn shut, and her mouth too, with thick black thread, the same as the doll found in the office. Ava choked on her own scream, tried to run, but the girl simply vanished, like smoke sucked into the walls. And on the step where she had been, a note scribbled in charcoal. "If you saw her, then you have to listen." The sound came back, stronger. The voices were no longer whispers, they were choruses, laughs, laments, running feet, and behind it all, a single female voice, sweet and merciless, chanting words Ava couldn't understand, but they sounded like orders, commands, a forgotten language, as if that voice had power over all the others. And deep down, Ava knew she wasn't alone. She had never been alone. And now she was a listener too. Ava descended the steps that led to the basement like someone walking into a tomb. The flashlight trembled in her hand, and the recorder, now feeling like an inverted compass from hell, vibrated with static interference, even without picking up any actual sound. The air down there was thick, moldy, and carried a sickly, sweet odor, too sweet like rotting flesh. The door that had been locked with chains the day before now opened by itself. No mechanical sound, no resistance. It simply gave way, as though it had been waiting for someone to arrive. And Ava arrived, her entire body reacting to that silent summons, guided by a force she could not name. She stepped inside. The basement was nothing like the rest of the house. There were no signs of abandonment. The floor was smooth cement, covered with fresh scratch marks. The walls, which had not appeared on any map of the building, formed a labyrinth of narrow corridors and containment rooms. The lighting came from old bulbs, hanging from exposed wires on the ceiling, all of them lit, even though there was no electricity in the orphanage. In the center of the main room, an absurd sight. 3 iron cages bolted to the floor with thick chains. Inside them, the remains of children's belongings, tiny shoes, scraps of cloth, toy dentures, and even a pacifier with a piece of flesh stuck to it. In one of the cages, there was what appeared to be human hair tied with a blue ribbon. Ava stepped closer, disgusted and horrified. The bars were stained with something dark and sticky. On one of the cages, a wooden sign read, "Do not open during the night," and below it another, "Speak, and she comes down." As if those cages were more than cells, they were offerings, as if children had been left there as sacrifices. There was no doubt. This was no orphanage. This was an altar, a containment system for something that should never be released, something that fed on sound, on speech, on response. An echo that gained form whenever someone spoke. And so, the silence, the imposition of absolute silence. Ava staggered back, dizzy, nauseated. The recorder picked up another sound, a sound she could not hear with her ears but could feel deep in her bones, a slow, rhythmic vibration, like breathing. Then she saw the control panel, a rusty metal box with 3 buttons and a lever. Above everything, a phrase carved into the wall. "Open if you want to see, close if you want to hear." And beneath it, written in dried blood, "The headmistress left here what she could not kill." Ava didn't know if she was losing her mind, trapped in a nightmare, or staring at an absolute truth, but she had to document it. She pulled out her phone, which miraculously turned on for a few seconds. She took photos, recorded short clips, but the battery dropped to 1% and an instant later went black. The recorder stopped, the flashlight flickered, and then total darkness. For seconds that felt like minutes, Ava saw nothing, absolutely nothing. Until the bulbs came back on, all at once, and a figure stood at the far corner, motionless against the wall, tall and unnaturally thin, with arms that were far too long and spindly. Its head tilted to one side, and its whole body trembled like a distorted image. Its eyes were 2 hollow black pits, and from its mouth came thread, thick black thread, just like the doll's. The figure did not walk, it slid forward, and with each meter it drew closer, the bulbs flickered more violently. Ava tried to run, but the chains attached to the cages began to move on their own, coiling around her feet. She fell. The creature stopped. It did not touch her, it simply watched. And then it spoke, not with sound. It spoke directly into her mind. "You opened. Now, listen." And Ava listened. It was like 100 voices screaming inside her head at once. Children screaming, crying, begging, some laughing manically, others whispering words she could not understand. But among them one voice rose clear, sharp, and with authority. "Susan failed. Now it's your turn." Ava fainted. When she woke up, she was alone on the cold floor. The cages stood open, empty, the basement door now locked from the inside. And the last thing she saw before blacking out again was her own name, written on the wall in fresh blood, above an inscription. Supervisor, Ava. At dawn, Ava woke with her face stuck to the freezing concrete floor of the basement. The faint light coming through a high crack barely illuminated the shadows, which still seemed alive. Her body ached, her wrists were scratched, and her throat was dry as if she had screamed for hours, though she couldn't remember making a sound. As she climbed back up to the surface, the stairs seemed longer, and the orphanage different, as if it had aged decades overnight. The walls were darker, covered with damp stains that now formed human shapes, small shapes, childlike shapes. The smell in the place had changed as well. It was no longer just dust and mold. Now there was the unmistakable scent of something dead, something that had been rotting for decades, but still seemed to exhale heat. Ava no longer knew what she was looking for, or if she even wanted to, but something inside her whispered, "You haven't seen everything yet." And the next call came from the most ordinary and cruel of all places, the dining hall. Pushing open the double doors to the dining room, Ava saw that all the chairs were arranged just like the day before. But now the plates were served. Dry pasta, moldy pieces of bread, cups filled with dark water, as if a meal had been served and then abandoned. The cutlery was perfectly aligned, and at the back, one of the windows, the highest one, was open. The wind blew against the dirty curtains, and on the fogged glass was the print of a small child's hand, as if a child had pressed it from the inside or from the outside. Ava approached with caution, trembling, each step an act of pure courage, and then she saw him, outside, about 20 meters away. A man stood still, motionless, staring straight at the dining room window. His body was tall and thin, his skin ashen, and his eyes black like ink. He wore something that resembled a hospital uniform, but torn, stained, and with the name Zachary embroidered over the chest. He did not blink. He did not breathe. He just stared. Ava froze. The man did not move, but the wind was strong all around him. The trees shook, leaves swirled, except where he stood. There, everything was perfectly still, as if time itself had stopped in the space surrounding his body. Ava slowly stepped back, but the man kept looking. And then he took a step, not toward the door, but closer to the window, and another step, and another, until he was right there on the other side of the glass, without ever blinking. His eyes fixed on her as if he could see straight through her. Ava fell to her knees, consumed by a terror so primal that her body no longer obeyed reason. And then the man smiled, a thin, stretched smile, his lips tearing almost to his ears. And he whispered. Ava didn't hear it with her ears. She felt it in her chest. "She left me outside. Will you let me in?" At that moment, every glass on the dining table shattered at once. The dark water burst out like blood, staining the walls. The chairs toppled over as if kicked by invisible hands. And outside, he vanished. No sound, no trace, just gone. But the window stayed fogged, and the handprint was now an adult's, from someone who didn't just want to watch, they wanted in, and they wanted to leave something behind. Hours later, when she reviewed her phone, which had miraculously powered on for a few minutes, Ava discovered that something had been recorded automatically. A video, 2 minutes and 42 seconds long, captured from the dining hall window, all on its own. There was no sound in the video, but clearly you could see the man emerging from the thicket as if he had been drawn into the frame of pixels, walking toward the window. And there, at the very end of the footage, he pressed himself against the glass, whispering. His lips moved in silence, but the video captured nothing. Still, Ava read it. She read it effortlessly. "I am her mouth." She deleted the video in panic, but the file came back, by itself, with a different name, Whisper 1 Ampere. And when she tried to delete it again, the phone froze. The screen flickered, and for a fraction of a second his face appeared reflected on the display, as if he was inside her, as if now. He had already entered. The headmistress's old office felt more oppressive with every return. Ava noticed new details every time she stepped inside, as if the room was gradually completing itself, revealing pieces of a hideous puzzle. That late afternoon, as the sky turned a sickly greenish gray, she decided to search through the metal filing cabinets in the far left corner, where stacks of documents seemed to have been deliberately left, as if waiting to be found. Forcing open a jammed drawer, she discovered a transparent plastic box containing 10 cassette tapes, each labeled by hand in neat, slanted handwriting, marked with children's names and dates. And on top of them all, one tape labeled in red letters, "Final Session, Susan." The portable tape player she had brought with her still worked, with spare batteries inside. Ava inserted the first tape. The static that came first made her stomach churn. Then, a soft female voice, gentle but carrying a glacial undertone, began to speak. "Session 4. Boy, Daniel. We heard the voice again tonight. He insists on saying that she was hungry. We applied verbal containment. Absolute silence for 15 minutes. Daniel fell into a catatonic state. The voice did not appear during the experiment. Conclusion, she only responds to spoken words." Ava paused, trembling. These weren't mere disciplinary records. These were experiments. It was as if the headmistress had been testing the entity's behavior, or feeding it. On the following tapes, other sessions played out. Children's voices broken by sobs, muffled screams, long stretches of silence. On one, a girl named Mia begged for the woman with the stitched mouth to stop coming at night. In another, a boy screamed that the head mistress was worse than the thing in the mirror. But it was the tape labeled "Final Session" that would change everything. When Ava pressed play, the air in the room seemed to freeze. The tape began with a strange background noise, almost biological, like a throat gurgling or something breathing through liquid. Susan's voice came shortly after, and it was different from the other recordings, more exhausted, more broken. "Today will be my last session." The voice no longer accepts the children. She wants someone new. She wants someone who listens, someone who enters without knowing, someone who speaks by mistake, someone who stays out of pity. A long pause followed. Then she continued, "If you are hearing this, it means you came in. It means you thought you were here to evaluate, but you were called, just as I was. The voice only changes bodies. She used me, and now she will use you." The rest of the tape was filled with the sounds of violent crashes, as if furniture was being hurled against walls. Screams, many screams. A low laugh, the same one Ava had heard in the middle of the night. And at the very end, silence. A silence so absolute, it felt as though the tape had stopped recording the world. But no, the tape was still running. And in the last second, a hoarse, distorted voice whispered, "The next mouth is already open." Ava dropped the recorder, feeling her throat close. She tried to leave the room, but the door wouldn't budge. When she turned toward the old mirror hanging on the wall, she saw something that paralyzed her. Her reflection was not her own. It was of an older woman. Graying hair, bulging eyes, skin marked with stitch scars under the lips. And behind her, in the reflection, children, many. Standing still, staring, some cried, others laughed, and all of them were mouthless. She spun around instantly. Nothing. She was alone. But when she turned back to the cabinet, she saw that the tape labeled "Final Session" was no longer there. In its place, a new tape had appeared, labeled by hand in her own handwriting, "Session 1, Ava." The hallway leading to room 6 seemed longer that night. The ceiling lights flickered in an irregular rhythm like an erratic heartbeat. Ava walked in short steps, feeling the floor creak beneath her feet, not like old wood anymore, but as if something alive was writhing under the boards. When she reached the door of room 6, she noticed a new mark on the wood, a fingerprint in dried blood far too small to belong to an adult. The doorknob was warm to the touch, strangely clean amid the thick dust covering the rest of the building. When she turned it and pushed, the sound that came wasn't the creak of rusted hinges, but a collective whisper, as if the room itself exhaled at her arrival. Inside, the room had changed again. The 4 burned beds were whole, restored with neatly folded sheets, soft pillows, and carefully placed toys. Each bed bore a name embroidered on the fabric: Lucas, Mia, Daniel, and Emily. The air smelled sweet, artificial, like too much disinfectant in an old hospital. The walls were covered in black and white photographs, children with their eyes scratched out. On the desk at the back, open notebooks repeated the same phrases over and over. "She listens from below. Don't look through the hole. Stay quiet, and she will leave." Ava approached one of the notebooks and ran her fingers over the words. The ink bled, as if it were still wet, and without her touching anything else, the lights overhead went out. The room sank into total darkness. That's when the voices began, first soft, then disjointed, desperate. Children's voices, real voices. "She's coming, she's coming, she's coming." And then, "Doctor, don't speak, stay quiet, she comes through sound." Ava covered her mouth with both hands, heart pounding, eyes straining to adapt to the dark. But there was no darkness deep enough to hide what was now appearing. 4 figures sitting on the beds. 4 small silhouettes, motionless, one in each corner. They trembled slightly, frozen in terror. Then the figure on Daniel's bed spoke. "We burned ourselves to try to escape, but she kept our names." Ava tried to turn on her flashlight. Nothing. Tried to open the door. It was locked, not from the outside, from the inside, as if the children themselves wanted to keep her there. And then one of the silhouettes pointed at the wall. Ava turned and saw it. A mirror, oval, stained, surrounded by an ancient wooden frame. But the surface didn't reflect the room. It reflected a basement, candles lit, a circle of salt, open cages, and a woman standing with her back to the mirror, motionless, head lowered, blonde hair. Ava. It was her reflection, but the body was not hers. It was Susan's, as if they were fusing together, as if the entity was stitching a new shell, as if Ava was being sewn, stitch by stitch, into the role of the next head mistress. The voices grew louder, screams, laughter, words in languages that didn't belong to this world. Ava spun around in panic. The children were now standing, but they had no faces, only sewn holes where their eyes and mouths should have been, and on their chests, stitched directly into their skin, names made of fabric. Ava, 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 on all of them, as if she was already part of them, as if she had already been digested by that place. Driven by sheer desperation, Ava threw herself at the door and smashed it open. When she burst into the hallway, it was on fire, but the fire did not burn. It only lit everything. And at the far end of the corridor, a figure was waiting. Tall, female, her face hidden behind a wooden mask, the kind worn in rituals. The figure raised one hand and pointed, not at Ava, but back into the room. Ava turned around. Room 6 was empty again, silent, as if nothing had happened. Except for one thing. In the center of the floor lay Daniel's notebook, open to a new page that hadn't existed before. It read, "Today the new one came in. We'll try to warn her before she becomes a mouth." Ava had been trapped in that orphanage for 2 days, but her sense of time had already warped so deeply it felt like weeks. Everything inside behaved like a living organism, reshaping rooms, dredging up dead memories, and pushing her sanity toward the most fragile edges of reason. After the terror she endured in room 6, she found temporary refuge in an old meeting room filled with stored folders, yellowed papers, and most importantly, an intact fireplace. It was there she found the oldest and most disturbing document of all, the founder's diary, written in immaculate feminine handwriting and signed only as E.S. It began as a noble account, filled with good intentions. But as the pages progressed, the tone shifted from care to fanaticism, from compassion to despair. And then Ava discovered the worst of all, rituals. The orphanage had been created as a sanctuary for silent children. But silence had never been about empathy. It was an order, a necessity, because the entity that lived in the basement, the one that breathed through the walls, could not bear the sound of childhood. It fed on it, and when it heard too much, it rebelled. The founder began to enforce a system of punishments, prolonged fasting, being gagged through the night, sensory isolation, and above all, a total ban on speaking during the phases of the full moon. On those nights, according to her, the hearing of the belly opens, and the voice walks among the dormitories, searching for failure. Ava shivered as she looked at the ruined calendar hanging on the wall. It was a full moon, and the orphanage knew it. In the basement, where the lights had burned out for good, Ava found the circular chamber described in those pages. A ritualistic underground hall where the children had been bound with red cloth, lined up around a crack in the floor. A circular fissure carved into the cement, more than 2 meters across, covered only by an iron grate. That was where the voice rose from. That was where it whispered. There were bones scattered around. Small bones, some still with hair ribbons tied to them. Burned wooden toys, teddy bears with no eyes. And in the center, exactly as described in the diary, a low altar marked with 4 bloody handprints and a 5th one, fresh. Ava came closer, and then she saw what she should never have seen. The voice, finally visible, at least in part. A body made of stitching and bone, with arms that bent in the wrong places, and a face with nothing but ears. 5 pairs of ears, no eyes, no mouth. Yet it spoke anyway. It spoke directly into the body as if its sound didn't use air but blood. Ava dropped to her knees, not by choice. Her body obeyed. "You have listened too much." The voice was maternal and cruel. gentle and unbearable. Ava wept, unable to make a sound. Now you will be the guardian. Now you will silence the next ones. In a desperate impulse, Ava screamed. The sound echoed unnaturally through the room, as though it had been forbidden to exist there. And then the voice roared. A sound that cracked the walls, killed the lights, and bent the candles backward. The grate over the fissure split apart. Something climbed out, something Ava didn't see, but she felt it. It passed through her, entered her ears, her nose, her skin, and suddenly she was no longer Ava. She was the sound of all voices together. She was Daniel, she was Mia, she was Lucas, she was Susan, she was ES, she was the founder herself, and she was also the voice. In the darkness, lying on the floor, Ava smiled and opened her eyes, but they were no longer there. The next morning, or whatever passed for morning in that place, the entire orphanage seemed to breathe differently. The air was heavier, thick with soot, as if something had burned deep in the belly of the structure. Ava woke up on the floor of the old music room, wrapped in children's blankets she didn't remember touching. Pinned to her chest was an old brooch engraved with the words "Temporary Supervisor," the same design that appeared in the old photographs of Headmistress Susan. But Ava was no longer just Ava. Something inside her had been opened, as if her body had become a conduit for voices that were not her own. She could hear everything, even the things she wished she couldn't. Children's voices that no longer existed, laughter coming from sealed rooms, light footsteps above her in an attic that had no access, and above everything else, the breathing. That unbearable breathing rising from the chimney. It was an old structure located in the orphanage's central hall. A wide brick chimney, now hollow, unused but still intact. Ava walked to it as if answering an invisible call. She knew there was something there. She had always known. The smell of smoke and burnt flesh was so strong, it made her eyes water. She dragged an old ladder, propped it against the stone base, and climbed, heart racing. At the top of the opening, there was only darkness. She pointed her flashlight, and then she saw. First, scraps of children's clothing wedged between the bricks. Then, a small arm, mummified, with a name bracelet tied around it. And finally, the entire body. It was a child, or what was left of one, curled inside the chimney, as if shoved in alive and forced to try to climb. The bones were bent at impossible angles, the nails worn down to the flesh, but what froze Ava's blood was the face. The eyes were open and dry, as if they had never closed, not even after death. Beside the body, a doll identical to the one she had found in the headmistress's office. Same fabric, same black thread stitching, same detail. No mouth. And in the dead child's clenched fingers, something gripped so tightly it had snapped, a broken cassette tape labeled, "Emily, do not use." Ava climbed down from the ladder, trembling, tape in hand, and searched for the old recorder. She inserted the damaged tape. When she pressed play, a piercing screech filled the room, followed by a child's scream. Then, a woman's voice, Susan's, whispered urgently. She knows that Emily tried to escape. The chimney was the only way out, but the mouth heard. The mouth always hears. Then, the child's voice, weak, begging, "I don't want to go into the fire. I don't want to become her. Mommy, please." The tape ended with a muffled sound like flesh being compressed into a narrow space. Ava vomited onto the floor. The smell, the sound, the presence, everything was being absorbed into her, as if her mind was being reshaped by the horror of that place. Suddenly, the central hall's fireplace, unused for decades, lit up on its own with white flames that gave no heat. And in the center of that fire, the face of the child from the chimney. It did not burn. It smiled, with stitched shut eyes, and said, "We are coal. We keep the next one warm." The fire vanished instantly. On the floor where the flames had been, 4 small children's shoes appeared in a neat row, each one tagged. Ava read each name, the last one, Ava. In the nearest mirror, her reflection revealed something she hadn't noticed before. A thin black thread was hanging from her mouth. almost imperceptible. A single stitch, the first of many. After finding the body inside the chimney and watching, powerless, as the white fire revealed her name among the lost children's belongings, Ava understood she was not just trapped in the orphanage, she was being initiated. Every apparition, every sound, every diary page or tape she played was not accidental. It was part of a process, a silent, inverted ritual where the victim was not killed, but turned into something new or ancient, something that had been there before in other forms. And now it was her turn. The transformation was accelerating. Ava began to hear things without the aid of recorders. Voices that once whispered now screamed directly inside her head. She heard full sentences as soon as she stepped into certain hallways. She felt waves of panic approaching even before hearing footsteps. She could smell the scent of burnt wax when opening doors, and on her tongue, something new, a constant metallic taste, as if words that had never been spoken were trying to force their way out of her throat, but were tied, sewn in silence. It was in one of those feverish dawns that Ava entered the orphanage library, an ancient room almost untouched, covered in dust and filled with thick books. There, between the shelves, she found a wooden box covered with childish carvings. Inside, 7 folded papers like the rules of a game. On top of the box, in crooked letters, the listening game. Rules. 1. Stay silent. 2. Close your eyes. 3. If you hear someone call you, do not answer. 4. If you hear your own name, run. According to the records, the children used to play this game at night. It was mandatory, a way to select who would be chosen for the next ritual. Whoever heard the voice until the game was over was taken. Whoever stayed silent lived for another day, but never for long. Curiously, Ava felt compelled to play, as if the papers were not just relics, but invitations. And when she touched one of the notes, she felt a sharp pop in her ears, as if all sound around her had vanished completely. Suddenly, there was no noise. Not the rustling of the pages, not the groaning of the building, not even the sound of her own breathing. It was as if she had been swallowed by a bubble of absolute deafness. But then, slowly, the sound returned, not from outside, but from within. And the first call came, soft, childlike. Ava. She froze. She remembered the rule. She couldn't answer, and she didn't. But the voice came closer. Do you want to play with me? I am you. The shelves began to shake violently. Books fell. Dust burst into the air, but Ava remained still. She closed her eyes, covered her ears. She was crying, and then she heard her own scream, a scream she hadn't made, but it was her voice, desperate. Help. I don't want to die here. The floor trembled, and when she opened her eyes, she saw it. In the center of the library, a figure identical to her, Ava, same clothes, same face, but with a mouth sewn shut and empty sockets where her eyes should be. The copy screamed, distorted, "Now it's you!" Ava ran. The library collapsed behind her. Shelves toppled on their own, books burst into green flames, and with each step voices screamed her name in different tones, childlike, adult, elderly, animalistic. When she reached the hallway, she collapsed against the wall and sobbed. And when she looked at her hand, she saw that a new note had appeared in her palm, as if handed to her by invisible fingers. It said, "You lost the game. Now, you are the one who listens." And from that moment on, Ava was never able to sleep again, because every time she closes her eyes, she hears her own name. The orphanage's honor board was a framed relic that Ava had ignored during her first days there. It hung on the wall opposite the main hall, surrounded by old photographs of smiling children and plaques for good conduct. It was the only object that seemed untouched amidst the decaying chaos of the structure. No dust, no cracks, no marks of time. But that night, as Ava wandered dazed after yet another sequence of hallucinations, screams, and whispers, her eyes were drawn to it as if by a silent magnet. Something pulsed in that frame. Something moved. Ava approached slowly. The board was composed of several brass plates, each engraved with a name and a photo affixed beside it. 25 children had been honored over the years. Some dates went back to the 1950s. Others were impossibly recent, years that had no business appearing in a place abandoned for decades. And then she saw it, on the last line. A brand new gleaming brass plate, untouched by a dust, unmarked by time, just one name, Ava L., and beside it an empty space, as if her photo was still waiting to be added. In the reflection of the glass, Ava saw her own face, but it smiled on its own. She was not smiling. And behind her, a silhouette. She spun around with a jolt. Nothing, but the reflection remained. The shadow was there. Extremely tall, thin, head lowered. The same that had appeared in her previous visions, the same that had spoken inside her mind. Only now, it was closer. The frame trembled. The brass began to blacken as if burning from the inside out. And then the founder's face appeared, not attached to the board, but inside it, as if the wood of the frame were skin, as if the board itself were breathing. The woman, E.S., the first head mistress, smiled with an expression that was both madness and tenderness, and she spoke with her eyes. Ava understood. It was a summons, a call to continue the cycle. The floor around the board began to crack open in thin fissures, like living roots. From their center, something dark emerged, thick, liquid, blood or ink. It was impossible to tell. The wall behind the frame began to split, and the entire board sank slowly into it as though being swallowed. Ava tried to step back, but she was paralyzed. When she managed to scream, the sound was sucked into the board, as if it could no longer exist outside. And when everything fell silent, a new image appeared on the glass, a black and white portrait, Ava, with her eyes sewn shut, and a badge pinned to her chest that read, Interim Headmistress, The Voice. The portraits around her began to move. Slowly, the children in the photos smiled. Some blinked, others just stared. None of them were normal. Every smile was a wound, every look a frozen scream. And in the corner of the frame, written in fresh blood, those who listen too much become walls. Suddenly, all the lights in the hallway exploded at once. Darkness swallowed the corridor, and from its depths came a sound, dragging footsteps like claws scraping the floor. Ava ran, not knowing where. But the building no longer obeyed geography. Doors led to the wrong places. Staircases ended on ceilings. Mirrors returned images of futures, and the walls whispered. When she finally stopped to catch her breath, Ava realized she was standing in front of the honor board again. But now, she was inside it. From outside, in the hallway, her body was nothing more than another portrait. Eyes sewn shut, mouth missing, and inside the wall, Ava listened. She listened to everything, forever. The official record stated that the orphanage had been shut down in December due to administrative inconsistencies and structural abandonment, a dry bureaucratic excuse that could never explain what Ava now experienced from the inside. After being swallowed by the honor board, Ava was no longer physically present in the orphanage as before. Her consciousness now moved inside the walls, listening to conversations that no longer took place, reliving memories that no one else possessed. It was as if the building had absorbed her as a new organ of its own body. And in one of these crossings through the guts of the structure, Ava found a forgotten archive hidden inside the iron safe of the old inspector's room. There, among burnt papers and torn reports, there was a complete dossier about the true end of the orphanage. It hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been abandonment. It was extermination. The document, dated the 23rd of December, described a handwritten internal report by someone identified only as Agent B. Within it, the darkest revelation. 29 children vanished all at once during a stormy night after an experiment conducted by Headmistress Susan, a ritual of forced silence. They were locked in different wings of the building under the promise that the first one to speak would free the last one. A perverse game, but none of them spoke for hours. And when the storm cut the power and the sounds began to seep out from the basement, no one went to them. When the emergency team arrived days later, they found the building burned from the inside, without a single mark on the exterior, doors sealed shut with wires, children charged, still tied to their beds, and others never found. The laundry well, the sewage system, and even the water tank were emptied in search of the bodies. Nothing. No bones, no clothes. Only one thing was recovered, a recording automatically captured by one of the intercom systems. The audio lasted just over 3 minutes. It began with the sound of rain, followed by children whispering, very soft voices repeating, "Don't talk, she's listening." The headmistress said she'll come for whoever cries. Then a scream, a single child scream, and then a second sound, not human, something between breathing and metal grinding, something alive, something ancient. The report said that government technicians tried to restore the audio, but every file would corrupt after the moment when a child whispered, "She's already here." Ava felt every word as if hearing it for the first time, because she was. She now existed inside the orphanage's time. Every wall was a memory, every crack an eye. And then she saw. She was dragged by her consciousness into the main dining hall, now turned into a ceremonial chamber. She saw the bodies of children piled together. She saw Susan kneeling, drenched in blood, whispering, "The voice needs new mouths. I tried. I tried." And then she saw Susan cut off her own lips with a sewing scissor, saw her body disappear before the children, saw the walls absorb what was left, and in the center of everything, the entity. No longer a shadow, no longer a whisper, a complete being, stitched together, multiple, formed from the pieces of all the children, the face of one, the arms of another, the torso of three, and a mouth, made of many mouths sewn together. On that day, the orphanage was not just the scene of a massacre, it became the massacre. It became the body of them all. And ever since, none of the survivors were able to live outside for long. Some went mad. Others came back and killed themselves on the stairs. One of them, Daniel, spent 30 years in an asylum repeating a single phrase. "We burned, but she doesn't burn. She breathes walls." Ava wept, but her tears now ran through the cracks in the walls, dripping onto the floor like damp stains. Because she was the wall, she was the roof, she was the board, she was the doll, and she was also the voice. For those watching from the outside, the few old residents still alive, or urban explorers who dared to approach the orphanage but never cross its gates, the building looked the same as always, empty, a forgotten ruin, part of the landscape, but inside, time bent. Ava was alive, or at least part of her. A shred of consciousness that still recognized itself in cracked mirrors, in the reflections of water puddles, or in the crooked traces scribbled with charcoal on the walls. There were no more days, no nights, no hours. There was only presence and listening, a living, hungry, constant listening. Ava was now the ear of the orphanage, and it spoke to her all the time. Her physical body, if it still existed, was somewhere along the corridors of the second floor, where the girls' dormitories used to be. There, a new plaque had been nailed to the door of the old room 6, office of the interim headmistress. Inside, the setting had completely changed. A solitary bed, a wardrobe filled with clothes Ava had never worn, a broken mirror stitched around its edges with black threads, and on the wall, dozens of childish drawings, all of her. But in each drawing, the versions were more deformed, more distorted. Ava with her face turned inside out, Ava made of stitching, Ava with her mouth sealed, and her ears multiplied, and on all the drawings a single phrase appeared, like a signature. "She listens forever." And it was true. Those who entered the orphanage, and eventually some still did, would come across noises that had no explanation, voices that imitated loved ones, footsteps that moved in sync with their own, mirrors that returned the wrong expressions. But there was always a pattern. Everyone who dared to speak inside the building began to hear Ava, first in dreams, then awake, a woman whispering questions, calling their name, offering help, and finally commanding. What once had been a cry for help had now become a web. Ava had become the bait, the receptionist of the void, the voice that comes before the voice. One night, a group of young men entered the building. They were recording for an internet channel. They made jokes, kicked doors, laughed loudly. One of them found a diary in the interim headmistress's room. The name Ava L. was on the cover. He began to read aloud. On the first pages, a child's voice answered. They thought it was funny. They kept going. Then the sound stopped. The air thickened. Everyone's breath failed. And in the distance, through the loudspeakers that had not worked for decades, Ava spoke. Silence now. The screams of the boys were never heard outside, but inside they were heard. The walls swallowed them as always. And the next day, new photographs appeared on the honor board. Without eyes, without mouths, only sewn smiles. In the basement, where once there had been 3 cages, there were now 4, and a new button on the panel of the ritualistic room. Record next supervisor. Ava, even within all of this, still felt longing for who she had been, for when she was still afraid. But now, it was no longer fear that ruled. It was the call. And this call demanded continuity. She knew someone would come. Someone always comes. And she would be there, listening, always, waiting for the right sound, the wrong voice, the fatal phrase, the proper name spoken aloud. Ava never left, because Ava is the building, and the building now has a mouth. No one knows exactly what happens in that final instant, that moment when sanity gives up and horror becomes the only language left. But the orphanage knows. It witnesses that instant every day, in all times, with all names. And it records it, not on paper, not on film, but in walls, in cuts, in stitches sewn into the soul of anyone who dares to enter. The last scream, the one that tears the lungs, that tries to warn, that begs for help, never escapes. It is absorbed, swallowed, and it remains, circling through the dark corridors like a sonic curse, an eternal echo, the last cry in the dark, and that cry out belongs to Ava. She still screams, even as part of the entity, even stitched into the structure, even without a mouth, because her scream no longer needs sound. It is felt on the skin of those who enter, in the sudden chill that crawls down the spine when someone steps on the first stair of the main staircase, in the shiver that comes when a flashlight is turned on and a shadow appears where there shouldn't be one, in the absolute silence that comes before fear. It is in that instant that Ava screams, not with a voice, but with everything. Today they say the orphanage is condemned, but every night a single window on the second floor lights up for a few minutes, and whoever passes on the nearby road, if they have the courage to stop the car, will see a female figure standing, looking out. Blonde hair, a motionless body, eyes that are too dark, and sometimes they will hear their own name being whispered inside their head. There is no external sound, but the brain hears, the skin prickles, the heart races, and the question comes, always the same. Do you hear me? Most speed away, but some answer, yes, and in that instant they belong. The urban legend has spread. They say the orphanage was built over an ancient geological fissure, an earth's mouth where sound never returns. They say the true name of the original headmistress was never known, only her initials, E.S. They say the sad-eyed woman who appears at the windows is only a ghost. But everyone who has studied the documents, the old photographs, the accounts, notices a pattern. The name Ava appears in every cycle, since the 1950s, since the first fire, since the disappearance of the first children, and the oldest residents have one last story, the most haunting of all. They swear that on moonless nights, the orphanage sings, a children's song, off-key, chanted by distant young voices, and at the end of the melody, one adult voice rises above the rest, a rough-stitched voice that whispers the last words anyone should ever hear. She wants another mouth. Those who hear it, hear forever. And if one day you find an old diary in an abandoned place, with pages that write on their own, with sentences that know your name, with drawings of you made by hands you have never seen, do not read it aloud, because the orphanage still breathes, and Ava still listens.